Here we see three passages, A, B, and C, that have two things in common. First, they all cite secondary sources, right? And you notice passage A, all of these citations are to Miller and Kanazawa. Miller and Kanazawa is a secondary source because that book talks about other research studies. Kanazawa's done his own original research studies, but he's published those as original research studies, and he cites them in this book. We see other examples of secondary sources here. Tapa is a journalist. She works for Time Magazine. Kornblatt is also a journalist. She works for Newsweek. They're both, in their articles, they are citing another source, right? For instance, this University of Texas study. But, there's really, before we get to what's important in this sentence, this is where the sentence should start. It should start right here, right? And, that should be the sentence. And then we can just cite the source in back. But why cite the secondary source when you can go cite that original primary source, right? And that's the whole thing about secondary sources. They can help us find primary ones, and they're useful in that sense, right? Take a look at this revised paragraph below. This is really just that same sort of paragraph that we saw in passage A about the blonde hair thing, but instead of just citing one source throughout, it now has 6, right? And this is far preferable as a synthesis to just summarizing, saying, well, now I'm going to summarize Miller and Kanazawa, what they say about blonde hair, and relying entirely on them. Now, if you look here, how did we go from one source, Miller and Kanazawa, to 6? Well, a couple things. First, we can go and do some original research. We can find some more things about blonde hair on our own, and that's what's happened here. Here's an article by Carol Jama, that led to a nice quote. And here's a market report by Samantha Dover that includes some information about what types of hair dye people are buying these days. Okay, and so we see here's some new sources that have been added into the mix there, the Jama and the Dover. But these other ones, like Ridley, this is through Miller and Kanazawa, right? If you look at what Miller and Kanazawa say about blonde hair, we can just follow the trail. Let's take a look. Well, here's that section about blonde hair, and here's a footnote after that thing about women using hair dye for centuries. Well, let's see. We have to just follow the trail of breadcrumbs like we did in the critical analysis exercise. We see we're in chapter 3. Okay, so we need to go to notes. Scroll over to chapter 3. And we can see that note 2 is from Block, 1994. All right, now let's find out what that original source is called here. Block. Okay, here it is. Block Conrad, Blondes in Venetian Paintings. All right, now I can go to the library search node and see if I can't find that original source myself. All right, well, let's paste that title in there and let's see what we get. Ta-da! As we use secondary sources to find primary ones, it's always okay to use one secondary source, like Tapa, to find one primary one, like that University of Texas study. We can go ahead and cite that University of Texas study. We don't owe Tapa a citation in this scenario. The one condition here, we just have to actually look at the University of Texas study. Always review any source that you cite. Don't rely on the secondary source's interpretation. It might be biased, or it might just be inaccurate. We saw this with Miller and Kanazawa. And also, we've seen this if you've ever played the game of telephone. You start with something like actor's name, Benedict Cumberbatch, and look how that gets distorted as it goes from a primary to a secondary to a tertiary source. And then finally, if we're using one secondary source, like Miller and Kanazawa, to find multiple primary sources, just add in some additional sources to make it original. See the summary and synthesis lesson again, you need 3 sources at least to have that qualify as original. They can't all come from that one. And then also, as you've seen in the paraphrasing and quoting activity, we need to vary our pattern of organization from the secondary source for it to qualify as original as well. Other than that, this is a great way for us to find good primary sources for our